So first off, there's been a couple of changes, everyone. And so all you know, the Scrum Wednesdays crew got enhanced by these two lovely people here, Biljana and Mario. Boris is still part of the crew, just he's running a bit late. So this will hopefully help us reduce some of the so have more capacity. And other than that, we have our old new guest with a new topic, James Carpenter, executive agile coach, writer of Forging Agile Change, overall great guy and somebody who has a lot of experience from the trenches. And as a first time, we have our guest with his mystery guest, Mitya, who is also an engineer down to the core. And the two of them will guide us through the less huge implementation and the case study and some of the finer grain details for that. So James, the stage is yours.
Thanks for having us again, or having me again. And my buddy here, Mitya, who is, you want to say hi, Mitya? In whatever language makes you happy.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, a couple languages probably can do that, but common language, English. Доброе утро, добрый вечер. I don't know. That's probably not. That's close enough, but I know it's not exactly that part of the.
It comes through. It comes through very well.
Good. Happy to be here and contribute any way I can to this case study and to all of us here.
Thank you. And so what we're going to do is, I don't know if everyone has seen it. There is a pre-read for this, which if you didn't do it, that's not the end of the world. And what we're going to do is mostly, so let me do chat to the world. So there's this pre-read here. And if you go down, once you get there, you'll see that's actually a link to a recording for the same thing that we did for Twin Cities last meetup. And the handout that goes with it is the second thing I sent you, which is, so I'm in the middle of doing a I'm working through the LeSS trainer certification process, which includes going to see, you have to attend Craig Larman's CLP, Certified LeSS Practitioner Training, and you also have to attend Boss Vode's training. Both of those are no big deal. You sit in class and you're good. But the big work is you have to do a case study. So you have to have a previous experience at a LeSS adoption or a significant LeSS-like adoption of Scale. I've been fortunate to have been involved in 2 of them at this point. And then you have to write that up. And the case study that you write, which is really an experience report, is used as a scaffold for coaching conversations as you come up through that LeSS trainer licensing process. And it turns out that the case study is actually like 95% of the work, is what Victor tells me. So you get it edited first by your assigned mentor, who is another CLT, who's a CLT, and then eventually it gets further edited by Craig and by Boss. And again, all of that is an excuse for lots of mentoring conversations. So I'm in the middle of that. I can't say I'm a big fan of LeSS for all kinds of reasons. Everything that's in it resonates very strongly with my own experiences and my own value system. If you were to read the 3 books that Craig and Boss have written, they are basically a canonization of what's always worked. And unlike some other approaches, Scrum.org has a great one. It's very, very similar in the mechanics, but it's a little more silent about the organizational design perspectives, and LeSS really gets into the org design aspects in a way that other frameworks remain silent. And we won't talk about, it's not the evil contortion of the truth that is the most popular, heavily marketed one, right? whose name does not need to be mentioned. Anyway, so Mitria was with me. He is a key director at this large hardware software company that builds basically a data center on a pallet, and with all the administrative software to handle that, as well as the hardware and the blades themselves and everything. So we're going to go over that. This presentation of mine is, I've basically extracted the figures and their captions from the case study, and we're going to go over that. We're going to try to do that in about 20 minutes so that we can leave the rest of the time for questions. And so Mitri and I are going to do that real quick, and I'll go ahead and do a screen share. First off, has everyone found the handout from the link there?
Silence is agreement.
Silence is agreement. Okay. Let's see if I can keep some. All right. And Mitri, I'm going to set my timer here for 20 minutes and see if we can do a good job of staying in our box. Same thing as before. You ready?
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a case study. This is just an introductory letter. This is the handout portion. Here is an overview of the hardware. And Mitri, you did this great last time. Let's just see if we can do it great and quick. But I'll let you do this because you do it better than I do.
Yeah. So this is a diagram of the product. How much time do you have, James?
I gave us 20 minutes to get through.
Okay.
Remember, we're going to skip the single Scrum team, and then we're going to cover some depth in what we did with your group, and then we'll open for questions.
Okay, sounds good. So maybe just to paint a picture for this product. So imagine maybe we'll start with a blade chassis. So blade chassis sits in a data center rack, and it's about in rack units as many blade rows as you can see here, tall. So each within this chassis, you can tell there's 8 blades. The chassis controller actually sits in the back of the chassis, so it's really nice and clean design, very dense, good for compute density. Each blade has a CPU, storage, memory, and I/O, network I/O. And so there's eight blades, and it's really kind of generic compute blades. There are different configurations. We won't get into it. You can combine them potentially, and so on. So now from that, if we, I guess we covered the blade motherboard detail also. So each one of those blades has, in terms of software, it has a board controller, node controller. It has BIOS, as any x86 computer effectively has. So this BIOS and node controller talk to each other. And now if we move from node controller to this upper side of the right-hand block, to the administrator and the GUI, the configuration of each blade, the configuration of each motherboard is controlled by this administrator. And GUI, or there is a CLI also available, but most people use GUI in this case, so one, it can control each chassis, each blade within each chassis. Two, it can control many chassis. Potentially all the chassis can be in your deployment can be controlled with one GUI 1 administrator. You can deploy policies that are common to all the blades. You can deploy policies that are unique to all the blades. You can collect, or you do collect the data from the node controller, from the BIOS about the blade health. So that's the data that comes from the motherboard through the chassis to the administrator. And then you push down policies and configurations from administrator to chassis, to the node controller, and to the BIOS. Node controller collects information about each motherboard, environmentals, and so on. And the chassis controller controls all or collects and controls all the information about the chassis, also environmentals, and also any kind of errors that happen on that level. Let me know, James, if I skipped anything.
Yes, that's good.
Okay.
I guess I'll add the one other perspective, which is know that this MCS administrator up there, this is stable hardware. What's running there is high-level C++. It's mostly middleware. They would be offended by that. They would say, oh, but we're doing firmware. No, you're not. You're doing middleware development. You could have written it in Java and it would have been just fine. And in fact, some parts were written in Java for some other related aspects. But as you get down and you get towards even the blade chassis and stuff, but it's certainly by the time you get to the blades themselves, those are new hardware. The hardware is sometimes flaky. Some of that is written in assembly. You're getting, I think they're mostly written in C, but C without a, C where even the standard library is oftentimes mostly missing. So this kind of runs the gamut. Some aspects of this beast are stable middleware. What would apply to your regular web development would somewhat apply here. In other cases, you're very much in the area of boutique custom hardware, very much low-level hardware guys. The hardware is often flaky. So you're spanning the gamut here from sort of the flavors of engineering involved. Timeline. This timeline is real handy. It's handy to keep on a separate monitor, or even print out this page and make notes on it as we go, because it kind of pulls all the pieces together. Just know it's there. I did do an initial pilot team that was just pure Scrum. This was not Mitrius group. This was the diagnostic component. It would align with a requirement area in LeSS, except for the fact it really was a single team. So it was both independently releasable and also integrated with the whole, but most of the code was in an isolated component, even though they did have to touch other pieces. Stood this team up. Again, there's diagrams here we won't go into. Here's some happy team members in their team room. Here's the initial definition of done they used. This is sort of like that initial feature team read if you read the LeSS books. And again, this refers to that. Okay, now we're getting to the initial BIOS. So now we're talking about Mitrius group. So through a series of conversations, managed to get Mitria's interest, and Mitria decided that he did want to do this. Mitria, can you talk about that for like, I don't know, 30 seconds?
Yeah, 30 seconds will be difficult, but I'll try. So it's I remember this very clearly, that when James was working with other teams within the organization, as he said, diagnostics teams, that team I think was first that he worked with. People were talking about Agile and Scrum, and less about LeSS, but just in general terms, Agile. And I think there's a general knowledge that for firmware such as BIOS and hardware, which is BIOS very close to, quote unquote, you can't do Agile, right? It's just kind of known. I don't think anybody knows why it's known, but it's just known. And so that I also knew that. I didn't know why I knew that. I didn't have any reasons for it, but I just knew it's not something you do, and that was it. And so keep the story short, we had, James and I had a number of talks. You know, he would walk into my office and write things on the whiteboard, and it started making more sense to just, you know, listen more closely. We had a meeting that was supposed to be probably half an hour, lasted about 2.5 hours or 3, where essentially, you know, the concepts that James was bringing up, even though it's hard to bring up those concepts without any kind of lingo that's specific to Agile, you know, I think a lot of it he brought up without specific lingo, and it really resonated as, this is either the way I already attempt to run the team or do run the team, or this is a way where I struggle to run the team the way I want to, and maybe these methodologies would help me to put things in more structured way. And that's how we started. It's, you know, really just you know, kind of jump in, and, you know, we'll do first and understand later.
That's good. So Mitri is responsible for what was really a component team, which was the custom BIOS. Now, this is a hell of a component with a great deal of complexity. It is, to some extent, its own system in and of itself. You could, in theory, release the BIOS separate from everything else. In practice, you wouldn't, because no one would care. It's not like people go to Fry's or such and buy a computer and, oh, I'm going to use this custom BIOS from this company. No, they're not. They're using it as part of the overall product. But nonetheless, so maybe 40-ish people, double E types. I would say they were oftentimes better hardware people than they were software people. Just that's where their strengths were. They spend as much time in the lab as anywhere else. Oh, sorry. Although the truth is, we started and we created a less-like structure because it provided the transparency that we need. We did fix the structure within the team level, within the teams. We didn't fix the overall structural issues. And that, of course, came back to bite us in the end. We very quickly most everything that the team did, or the teams did, involved going through the node controller, going through the chassis controller, BIOS configuration. Those were components that were typically worked on by other teams. Over time, as the BIOS teams gelled, they continued to stretch themselves into those other components. The natural thing to do in the longer term would be to have gotten to the point that you formed up a full requirements area that was a full vertical slice all the way up to the GUI, that had a product owner that was in the product management group. We didn't have that initial level of sponsorship, so that we weren't able to initially go that far, but we were definitely working in that direction. And by the time we were done, we already had, the team was already starting to learn was on the path to start to learn to make changes in these other components, and had managed to get the buy-in. Here's the feature adoption map. I assume most of y'all are probably following along. Again, just as a repeat, in the chat, you can follow along with this as we go, and stop and read and ask questions, you know, make notes for later questions. So the original scope, you have to realize that these developers, there would typically only be 1 or 2 people that knew how to make a change in a certain part of the code. And it had been that way for a long, long time. And just the concept of everyone on all the BIOS teams can touch any of the BIOS code, even that was culturally a big stretch for them. So it is not as if we were not drastically moving in in a much different direction than they were used to already. We just weren't moving, stretching as far to the front end of the product as I would like to have done. But again, we started to move in that direction. When I showed up, I had this original senior VP. Within a day or two of my being on site, I sat down in his office and he explained to me, he said, James, the real question here is not what you can do for me. The question is, what can I do for you? How can I help you help me? And anything you need, you just let me know. And it was extremely clear to me that this senior VP / general manager was completely on board, was going to be actively involved at whatever aspects were needed in order to make changes. I could not have asked to be more supported than I was. Within a few weeks of my being there, within a month and a half or so, that SVP had been switched out to a different SVP whose objectives were, in retrospect, this person's optimizing goals were really about getting this product on a good financial footing that used less people and was still able to maintain the product as it existed. And this person was supportive of Agile from a verbal perspective, from what she would say, what this person would say. But I never had much time with this person. It was next to impossible to get time with this person. There obviously was not interest in that, yet they kept funding me. So there was a willingness to continue funding me to be there, but that level of active engagement I had before no longer existed. Now, what's interesting is those higher level middleware stuff, that all rolled up into a software VP whose behavior never seemed that supportive. I would argue passively aggressively didn't really want to change. Very smart person, not a bad person, you know, a well-meaning person, but definitely not bought in. And and as you moved up the stack into that, you know, as you started to get up in here, you're getting into stuff that VP of software is in charge of, or the teams report up through them. On the other side, down in BIOS, which presumably is under this hardware VP, but actually involves a tremendous amount of software, that's where Mitria is hanging. And there was buy-in there, and Mitria basically had the blessing from that hardware VP to, they'd worked together a long time. And the hardware VP said, hey, whatever you think is necessary, Mitria, I support you. And sort of better to rip the Band-Aid off quickly than slowly. So we had the support we needed. And Mitria was able to pretty much have some free will there. And we also needed some people that had experience with the end-to-end testing aspects. And again, they were hanging off a quality focused VP, but this person was supportive. And so we were able to get QAs that were software testing specialists who were assigned to the BIOS teams and effectively were no different than any other team member. We treated them like any other team member, even though formally in an org chart perspective, they were not. And that did eventually come back to bite us in the rear when there were some additional changes. But again, we got that new SVP. And then in the long term, this hardware VP left for another opportunity outside of the firm that was a really particularly compelling opportunity. And when that happened, all the hardware VP directors were folded into that software VP. So that happened way towards the end of my time there. And that definitely was, that's probably what sunk us more than anything else. again, not a bad person, definitely not someone who was bought in.
James, we have a question from our participants, if you are willing. Maybe you already half answered this, but the question is, how do you work without the support of software VP? How do you approach the teams?
Let's get to that when we get to QA. So I've got like 2 minutes left. I'll probably run and burn about 5, but
Okay.
then let's switch to QA. So,
Great.
But clarifying questions are good, really deep questions, and that's a great one. Let's hold them. And Bogdan, if you can kind of proxy these, if people have questions, please keep putting them in the chat, so Bogdan can collect these and send them to me and Mitria as we get farther. Geography, most people were in the Portland area, the San Francisco area, or a city in India, Bangalore. There was a little bit of difference from, I think there were 2 cities involved in some cases, but when you talked about BIOS, they were almost all in these 3 regions. What's interesting is that the BIOS code is, there's a third-party vendor that provides the majority of the BIOS code base, and then this firm makes changes. So my client makes changes to that code base. And yes, they're nitty gritty and involved, and it takes, a large number of people a long time to make all those changes. But compared to the bigger thing, what their changes are minuscule. It would be like you're making a change to the Linux kernel, and that may be a tremendous amount of work. And you may have 6 months of work for a large number of people to do that. But rewriting Linux is a whole nother beast into itself, right? So understand the scale of the issue is the BIOS is almost like a non-operating system, operating system for the BIOS or for the chipset before you even run the real OS on top of it. And so like a cell phone, there's multiple generations of this product, and a customer may buy a new blade and slide it into the chassis, into an old version of the chassis, right? Or they may buy a whole new thing, and then slide some of their old blades into the new chassis. And so some of the feature sets were some of the work that was being done by the BIOS engineers was focused on fixing existing releases to previous generations of the hardware. And some of the work was, we have a new prototype version of the hardware that we need to build new feature sets for, and also make sure, and this is the most of the work, make sure that it backward compatibly does everything that the previous versions did, right? So we had a trick here that we played, which was that for the people that were reporting up through Mitria, which were in the US, that's where all the work being done on the new generation of hardware was happening. And initially, the India group was working on older versions of the code. Now, you would hope that you have a non-branching model and all of that, but historically that was not the case. And actually that would only work if that third-party vendor was giving it to you that way anyway. So there was an opportunity to leverage that. So what we did is we formed up teams that our component boundary for these LeSS-like teams only included the people working on the newest generation of the hardware. And then as people working on the previous generations of the hardware became available that were in the US, we would roll them into this product, this component development group that was focused on the new stuff. And that gave us time to gel and get a lot of things in place before we struggled with the fact that now India is running out of stuff to do on the old generation hardware, and they're looking to start contributing to the new hardware. And so we kind of set the stage from a politician's perspective to make it so that by the time a different group of directors was involved that were based in India, because unfortunately the India BIOS engineers reported up to a different director, into the same hardware VP, but a different director, and that director in India wasn't really that on board. There were a few managers that were on board, but they were kind of subject to the whims of that director there. And you'll see that in that org chart if you look at it. And so we played a political game here of fixing our own house and setting up an opportunity to leverage the friction involved in the old way, trying to work with the new way, as a way to be able to win our case when the time came. And I believe that had we not lost our hardware VP at the last moment, I think that would have happened. There were also some massive layoffs that came down. Our initial launch was not unlike a lot of inceptions, where we put a bunch of stuff on the wall and we did basically brainstorming activities, blitz planning type work, until we got to a consolidated place. We did a variation of multi-team refinement, where we had smaller groups that would work on taking what we did our first in our initial launch, and then kind of chew that into more meaningful PBIs that met the invest test. And then we would throw them on a wall, and we would, which became a sort of a mix between a story map and a snake-like product backlog. And then we would have people come in and look at it, and we'd make changes again, and we kind of went through circles on that till it smoothed out. And eventually it did smooth out. And that was probably 2 or 3 sprints in before we had this looking somewhat decent. The delta here is that no one person had any freaking clue what all the pieces were. I have never seen the knowledge be more dispersed in more like PhD and master level people as I have seen, as I observed in this case. So that aspect is interesting. Usually there's 1 or 2 people that can kind of tell you what's involved, and they kind of lead the group. Here, you needed everybody's knowledge. For better or worse, well, okay, we'll get to that. We had a helper. We always needed a helper. So here's one of the background, the boards in the background that one of the teams had. Definition of done. One of the key elements of the definition of done is that we decided never again would we not use the pluggable layer. So historically, where is that? No changes outside the pluggable layer unless agreed on by a third party. Unless that BIOS vendor said we don't have another way to do it. But historically, there had been a lot of copy paste changes in this BIOS from generation to generation to generation. It's as bad as you could ever imagine. And it had never been done in a way that you didn't have to repeat all of that work for every single new generation of a blade, right? And that was one of the biggest changes here. This is just an example of using Triage Guidelines so that everyone on the team understand what's a real emergency and what isn't a real emergency, and to allow that decision to be made, by the person in the moment, by the individual team member, while still being respectful of the product owner's overall guidance. So it becomes and it also incorporates the collective wisdom of the group. So that's just a technique there. Reference content before I shut up and we go to questions. Well, just know it's here and read it because they're related. Organizations are implicitly optimized to avoid changing the status quo, middle and first level manager and specialist positions. And culture follows structure. In tiny org, structure follows culture. So if you're a startup, it's different. And that was certainly true. To the extent that we fixed structure, which we did below Mitria's level, it radically changed culture. To the extent that we didn't go after the HR policies as to performance management, and we didn't thin out that management layer, as you would do in a more aggressive, this is really a less huge adoption. there's a guide within LeSS to do LeSS a parallel org, where you basically set up a whole new group, and then you make sure that you're very flat in that new group to begin with, and you change a lot of this. And the reason you change all of this is it's a system that has a lot of self-reinforcing loops. So what's interesting is when Craig and Boss describe a parallel organization, they say a parallel organization is not a pilot. You know, this is a, hey, we're going to make this change and it's going to start rolling across the org. This is not just a pilot, like, for example, the diagnostics that we skipped over real quick was definitely a pilot. And one consequence is a line of organizational reporting must be separate from the traditional organization. We did not do that, and it came back to bite us. And again, this concept of, which is one of the LeSS rules, for the product group, establish the complete LeSS structure at the start. This is vital for a LeSS adoption. Now that's for LeSS. For LeSS huge, you would do it by requirement area. You would do it at each requirement area, you would do that. And at some level, we did do that. But again, we still had all these director and VP layers that we did not change. And it came back to bite us. Relevant LeSS guides, here you go. We were part of this overall linking into this waterfall delivery process that everybody else was doing. So even if we were running our own world in a more agile fashion, the rest of the people were not. And we were not quite above that contract game, even though the way we operated internally was that there were problems that happened because of because other parts of the organization that we were still somewhat related to were still treating estimates as commitments and were driving some pressures that were problematic. Let me be quiet. I'm at way longer than I wanted, and I don't think that we didn't get the depth we got last time by far. So I'm wondering about this whole idea of getting this in an hour to begin with. But let's go to QA. What do you got for me? Dimitri, Bogdan, what do you want first?
Maria, you want to take over? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the first question came from Ivana, and it was, how do you work without the support of software VP? How do you approach the teams?
I had buy-in from a director who wanted change within his group, and I would like to have had greater buy-in, but I didn't. But Mitra, you want to cover that?
Yeah.
You have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's how we started really. So there was a, you know, a sizable group that I was running at the time, and we just decided to change the group and not change the group, but change the way the group operates into LeSS. The challenge, of course, was interacting with outside of this group, with you know, for example, test organization, QA organization, and other software teams, and overall project management of the business unit, and fitting, you know, answering questions what by when, you know, and combining waterfall and LeSS and agile. That was a challenge. You know, I would also say that in doing this, at least I was hoping that others will join in and want change also. Sometimes it happened. In some cases, you know, we found people who supported this in other teams, and you know, the teams were not going through such a dramatic change, but more gradual changes. In other teams, we found more resistance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Does Ivana, does that answer your question? I think it kind of does. Okay. Can we go to our next question, James, if that's okay with you?
Which is
Which is, we know that you are a big fan of LeSS. Can you give us your thoughts on why any other framework would not be good or better to fit in this situation?
okay. So LeSS at a mechanics level, LeSS, and I would argue Nexus as well, is nothing other than what healthy, mature Scrum teams have been doing for years and years, long before any of it was canonized. That is to say, if you want to have everybody working in the same direction and working on the most valuable stuff, you're going to have a single consolidated product backlog. That's just the natural way to do it. And you're going to have feature teams that can touch everything, right? You know, if you go to Larman's class, he'll use causal loop diagrams to cause you to teach yourself these answers. But for a lot of the Agilists who are on the call, for a lot of software engineers who've been doing this work for a long time, it's no surprise that cross-functional feature teams that are all collaboratively working together and having a common priority across the organization is the no-brainer way to do it. If you're going to have multiple teams working together, you're going to have for sprint planning, you're going to have some sort of cross-team meeting followed by a per-team sprint planning type meeting. Nexus does this, LeSS does this. The same is true on the, if you talk about a retrospective, you're going to need a cross-team type of retrospective that addresses issues across all the teams, because many of the issues are systemic and are not really about one team. And you're going to also need retrospectives that focus on, you know, challenges specific to an individual team. So individual teams need their own safe space to have a retrospective to address their own problems. And you also need a way to address the systemic. Now, Nexus does this with a cross-team, per-team, cross-team. It has a sandwich. LeSS has just the per-team and then the cross-team. I think in practice, the LeSS's way is better because it lets the teams kind of do this before, kind of have their own mind, make their own mind up and not be influenced by what's going on systemically until you get to the overall. But that's not a big deal one way or the other. Sprint review, it's a common increment, common definition of done, common set of stakeholders. You obviously want a common sprint review. So we could go on and talk about all the various aspects here, and there are some subtle differences between what Nexus does and what LeSS does, and some of those are important. But in the big scheme of things, those are just mechanics, and they both align to what multiple feature teams working together have been known and done for a long, long time, which would be the antithesis of what you see, say, in SAFe, right? You know, the Scrum Guide, for better or worse, is silent on many facets, right? It's silent about reporting structures. It is silent about technical practices, say those extreme programming style engineering practices, right? And I think in many cases, those aspects are actually more important, or as important, definitely, than what is in the Scrum Guide. And what's interesting about LeSS is that LeSS is not silent on all of these critical aspects in a way that other frameworks are. You know, if Richard Hunhausen was here, he would say, well, if you take the Nexus course, you You know, they'll talk about all these supporting practices, and that's great. But at least in LeSS, here they are in the damn book, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's part of the canon. Now it's a big, fat, thick canon that is, you know, it's not light reading, and it's not something that you can cram into a 2-day course. But you know, you didn't learn to write software in 2 days either. You know, this is professional work.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't deal with the reporting chains and how people are financially incentivized to move forward in their careers, it will come back to bite you in the rear. Most approaches are pretty silent about that, and they're certainly not up to the kind of radical change that LeSS implies. But LeSS actually goes after that in a way that others, again, remain silent. So I don't think, you know, if you were to take LeSS and you would take someone on the Scrum Work side on Nexus, like Richard, I think you would find tremendous agreement as to philosophy. But I still think that LeSS puts it all out there in a way that others don't. And the problems that you see in things like SAFE are, you know, numerous. I mean, there's article after article of everything that's wrong with SAFE. So I guess in summary, that the answer is simple. Oh, by the way, just to defend Richard, Richard is even he is a fellow LeSS trainer candidate. So it's not as if Richard is not, you know, philosophically aligned. He is. Some of this is a tempest in a teacup. I think that what it boils down to is that LeSS is closer to the truth than anything else I have found.
Mm-hmm.
And I am yet to find anything in LeSS that does not strongly resonate with my own experiences of what actually does work and what actually is important. And LeSS is very careful to stay within product development. It doesn't, you know, pretend to move outside of that realm. It says, hey, you know, whether or not this type of process works outside, I don't know. We're worried about software, you know, firmware, hardware, software development. And for that, you need all of these engineering practices, and you need to deal with the org structure and all of these other things in a way that I don't see anywhere else. Okay, sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, but thank you. That was a really thought out answer. I think our participants are gonna appreciate it. Okay, so the next one is pretty practical. It says, do you have a helper like additional agile coach?
Oh, well, we did have a helper, of course. Yeah, we got to get back to that helper. Wherever that helper went, she's
Not
here
the
somewhere.
small one.
Yes, we had that helper.
Yeah,
So,
you must have somebody like that on your team.
Yes, you must have. You could run out of tape, you know. Support.
Okay. We're remote now. We don't need the tape.
That's right.
No, it was just me.
Uh-huh.
And how many teams are we talking about in engineering teams?
Okay, so within the division, we're talking like 4,000 people, 4,000 engineers. Okay. After some massive layoffs, which we didn't cover in detail because we're compressing this thing, we had about half that. When I'm working with the diagnostics team, you know, that's only, you know, 10, 12 people I'm working with. When we did the BIOS was, you know, maybe 40 engineers and some others we're working with as well. You'll notice the guidance in LeSS is, because you don't want to boil the ocean, you can only get so much done. What is it? The law of raspberry jam, the thinner you spread yourself, the less there is, right? So LeSS guidance would be that you only do about 50 people at a time. Mm-hmm. You will see that's about what we did. So the most that we could manage, especially with me being the only coach around. Now I come from a software engineering background, so well, there's another plug for LeSS. I believe engineers should be led by engineers. And I don't think that much of this process stuff is that hard compared to some of all the other stuff, right? I mean, it's hard, but it's, so I'm able to talk to both sides, right? The truth is it's extremely hard to find an Agile coach that has real world hands-on development experience. Not that I know anything about BIOS, I don't, but I've done enough middleware development that, you know, we could sit together and we could get answers. And I don't mean just Mitri and I mean myself and whoever's on the team I needed to sit with, we'd go sit and together we'd collectively work an answer out, because these were all sharp guys. You know, an Agile coach is a poison, right? A little bit can be healthy. Too much can be too much, right? You really need the teams to kind of own their changes. It's certainly true that I could have used a little bit more help, right? We certainly could have done more requirements area at a time had I had more help. You could argue that if there was a little bit more commitment to this change at the SVP level, which again, I think there was, and again, we lost it, right? Because when I lost that SVP, then I think we would have had more coaches. It is true that late in the game, I successfully hired some coaches in India. And finding good coaches was like pulling teeth. You know, most of them would fail.
Did they also have this development background?
Oh yeah, I didn't hire them unless they did. Yeah, so I was vetting them. So yes, I mean I wasn't getting paid. They weren't working through my corporation, but I was doing that on behalf of Trent. There's another person in the case study who was actually signing my time cards. Now I'm direct in this situation. So sorry, I directly owned the relationship. Agile Carpentry did not act as a primary vendor to the company. We did make use of a pass-through, but the pass-through was not part of the business arrangement other than a way they moved money, right? They would take money from one hand and give it to the other hand, but that's all they did, right? They were not involved in the discussions and the design and all of that. So it was just me and the end client from that perspective.
Okay.
Okay, let me stop. Am I answering your question? What
Yes,
you're asking, are there other coaches involved?
Yeah, you're answering.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next, I guess then.
Yeah, all right. So next two questions kind of overlap, so I'm just gonna go through both of them. So the first one is, did you combine Kanban and Scrum? And the follow-up kind of connects to that. What was the team's experience in Agile, Scrum, and/or LeSS before the LeSS adoption you provided for them? Was there any assessment of the teams done before the adoption?
Okay, so let's multiple parts here. I'm going to leave the really meaty, hard one till last, which is, did they have previous experience? There's some interesting biases and all there. But because of the nature of hardware, there were certainly some cases where Kanban could have made a lot of sense. In many cases, I taught the teams both. And remember, you can use Kanban with Scrum. They're not mutually exclusive, right? It turned out that for the work of the teams that I was working with, Kanban wasn't that useful. Or more specifically, they were nowhere near the level of maturity necessary that they would have benefited from the additional visibility that Kanban could have provided. In fact, what it probably would have done is continued to have maintained that silo between the QA and the software devs. But if you talk about how, you know, on the first floor of this building, there is multi-million-dollar hardware coming in and out all the time, and new hardware comes in that just comes from the fab and, you know, goes into a rack. This is prototype stuff. And then 3 weeks later, it's a useless doorstop. That's the nature of this business. Is, you know, this multi-million-dollar prototype hardware becomes a useless doorstop in no time. Because now, why would you want to test on the old gen? You test on the newest generation of maybe it still works, maybe it works hardware. So managing that process was very much more in the complicated systems domain than the complex systems domain, right? There were some project managers that reported to Trent that were very competent, who basically were managing that pipeline of hardware coming in and out the door. And if Mitria's guys say, hey, we need 10 new blades, they would talk to one of these project management types, and a month later, those 10 new blades would show up on the desk. Maybe they'd have to argue and say, no, you can get by with 8. Yeah, I guess we can, you know, but nonetheless, that would show up. So Kanban, I exposed them to it. In practice, it didn't make sense at the time. I think eventually it might have. It certainly would have if we had gotten closer and closer to the hardware side. I think the combination of the two would have made a lot of sense. There was another related question. Let's detangle. Assessments, yes. So the bigger scope is Trent and Trent's boss and the SVP had me come in because they had heard that I'd done good things at another division of this company. And so I did that. And remember, I said there's, you know, 4,000 people when I started. There were 2 or 3 other groups that were pretending to do some flavor of Agile, and I would spend a little bit of time with them, you know, just a few days, and you'd figure out real quick that they're not doing anything like Scrum, right? They're not doing anything like Kanban or Scrum. There's no common definition of done. There's no automated testing. They're not really teams. They're using Agile as an excuse to do whatever the heck they feel like. That's really the truth of it is. And they're still doing this commitment, the contract game, or treating estimates as commitments, or locking time and scope, whatever words you want to use for that same concept. That was still happening to them. And so mostly I said, well, hey, y'all don't even know what good looks like. Let's stand up this diagnostic team. Let's look for something that goes end to end, is actually meaningful to the end customer, would connect us, would have a charter that would connect us all the way to the customer, would have a team that would need to touch all the components all the way through the stack, and that architecturally is something that the team could do the work in such a way that, or the architecture, the natural architecture of the product is such, or the component, or the extended component is such that it's not overly entangled with the rest of the system. And the diagnostic component turned out to be a perfect fit for that. And so we formed up the diagnostic team. Every director coughed up a developer for the team, because this team needed to touch, as part of doing diagnostics, they need to make changes to all of these various components. So we built a true feature team, end to end, actually connected to the end customer. It even had the ability to partially release an increment at the end of every sprint, in the sense that as long as you only wanted to diagnose a single node, you could do that with an ISO image, but you couldn't go to the MCS administrator and say, I want to do this diagnostic across these 100 nodes. and have it automatically do that for you. For that, you'd have to wait for the freight train to go by. You'd have to stand on the platform. You'd have to make the integration into the overall manager aspect. But even some of this could be done by itself. So it was a perfect example of that. The problems, and it demonstrated what was possible. Without that, I probably would never have gotten Mitria bought in. The problems were that we didn't change that reporting chain. So we still had all these directors involved. And that was okay as long as I still had that SVP that sort of dictated leave these people alone. When I lost that, that fell apart. Had I instead kind of put this off in its own thing that reported straight up into that SVP, that would have been safer even once things had changed, right? But I lost that leadership, and no matter what you do, if you lose your top dog, it's really hard to recover from that. So then I did the BIOS stuff, which was, half a dozen teams. And there was a little bit of pull. I'd spend a little bit of time in other teams. But Trent and I kind of made a decision. If we're going to do BIOS, for lack of the ability to find anyone else that can do, there's no one else I can upskill quickly enough to be the Scrum Master here. I'm going to have to take Scrum Master duty for a little while. And so we kind of cleared my agenda so that I could do that. Was that before we get into the previous LeSS experience or previous Scrumming LeSS experience? Any other questions on that before I get into the nitty gritty one?
Okay.
Okay. So obviously there was some fake Scrum going on, right? But it wasn't the real thing. There were in some other divisions some actual real Agile efforts, but those are completely different divisions. And then Mitria, you've got some stuff to say about people came to this with different experiences, and a lot of them were understandably skeptical. Individual team members, sure. Even.
Yeah, for sure. There's everybody knew what I knew and what everybody else knew, that you don't do Scrum, you don't do Agile with BIOS, which turned out to be not the case, but proved that you can. So that was one barrier to overcome in terms of people perception of what they're going into. It's completely reorganization the way people are used to working for many years, 20 years or more of experience. BIOS development is very kind of in the lab, work on your task, finish your task on your own kind of work. And this is, we broke people into teams, broke up the team into teams and into smaller teams, and the team would pick up the tasks and get it to done and cover testing and at least attempt automation where possible. That was a complete change of style of work. I don't think it's a surprise that people have it's an adjustment, and some are able to adjust and some are not able to adjust. I have to be in a stand-up meeting every morning. Some find it useful, others have to be convinced more. So that, also other things that other rituals that we undertook, the retrospectives was a very different experience for everybody, including me. We took some maybe to add to the pain a little bit, but I think it helped. We did some improv, so like improvisational comedy, but nobody had to be funny. It wasn't a performance factor, but it was a improvisational kind of a warm-up exercise with very simple things, just to make the room of 20 people feel like they're doing the same thing, and adding to each other, adding to the overall value, adding to each other's thoughts instead of arguing. So that's also, so it's the experience went from, I'm just going to sit in the lab and work to I'm now in front of everybody and we're all working on this together and we're all trying to be better. And in trying to be better, may mean that you have to do things outside of just writing code. And actually, speaking of writing code, code review went on a different level too. That was an adjustment for everybody. Code review went from kind of the pull request has a code review check mark and you review code and you're done, to much more kind of open, and that caused some friction in the team for sure.
Okay, so, oh, sorry, did that answer the question? Sorry, before
Okay, yeah, I feel it kind of did, but Mario, who asked the question, maybe can say, does he feel that the answer is?
Yes, thank you. I have a following question, which is, what was, in your opinion, the main motivating factor for those people that had that kind of level of skepticism? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question. It's a little bit difficult to kind of, to come up with an answer for somebody, without that somebody being here. I think they'd probably say better than I would. But I think it's maybe many factors. It could be things are working. Things have worked in the last 20 years. Why are we changing now? It could be, I think it's just individual outlook on what the work environment should look like, what day-to-day work should look like. Again, it's just, I'm sorry, it's a little bit hard to kind of extract the answer from somebody who's not here.
I understand that's a difficult question. It's okay. Thank you. Yeah,
I can make guesses, but I'm not sure. This is all from my perspective. From my perspective.
I was thinking maybe if you had some huge main thing that you can remember and recognize as a turning point, but it's okay if it wasn't done like that. Thank you.
Mario, I can speak in general of what I see in general. And I think this was somewhat true within the BIOS group. And it was certainly more true of both at this client and other clients for people that have spent more time where they're likely to have bumped into a team running Scrum. Scrum is so very often used to micromanage the heck out of people. Estimates are treated as commitments, or that is to say, project managers attempt to use Scrum in order to provide much better visibility into what everyone is actually doing, and then to, pound on, are we going to meet our quote commitment for this sprint, right? Rather than are we going to commit to quality, commit to working as a team, and make as much of a forward motion as we think is actually practical, but always build it as well as we know how to build it, even if it means we don't get as much built as we hoped. And when you come from that environment, and that's how Scrum was abused, you're naturally resistive to it. So I think my experience is most of the time that people don't want to do Scrum, it's because they've been abused by it, and not by it, by a perversion of it. I'm sensitive to time here. We're trying to get this under an hour. We could take one more question, but I also wanted to run a quick retrospective, and well, I'll get to that. Well, one more question before we go to a retro.
Yeah, I think we only have one more in our chat, and I think it's a rather simple one. What do you think would happen if you didn't use LeSS, if you stayed in waterfall fake Scrum?
Well, they did stay in waterfall. They reverted. Mitri, you want to talk?
Yeah. I think it's You know, I don't think anybody particularly enjoyed waterfall in at least in that context. And I don't know if it's common or not, but in the context of that organization, I don't think, you know, waterfall was, you know, write code, deliver code, fix bugs. You know, at the end of release, see how many bugs we find. If we find this many bugs, it's a good quality code. If we don't find this many bugs, it's not good quality code. You know, the fact that, you know, a large portion of the development cycle was fixing bugs, fixing defects. I don't think that was enjoyable. So what would happen if we didn't? I think we'd just go to, you know, would go back to and you know, did go back to that less effective and less enjoyable way of doing development.
Would you say that from a strategic, so tactically, I completely agree with you, Mitria. Strategically, do you think that the level of innovation was impacted by, you know, going back?
That I don't know. I'm not there, and I wasn't there when it did go back. But I do see that what was developed in a short time, I don't know, was it a year and a half of Scrum, right, or something like that, 2 years? I don't remember now. Year and a half. The speed and quality of feature delivery and product delivery was better within the team than more usable code, and hopefully benefited even in the waterfall that followed. One thing, James, you mentioned, and I want to go back to this is Mario's question. I think that was one of the very concrete feedback that we actually got from people that, hey, I've tried, Scrum was tried on me before. It started well, and then it turned into using Scrum as, you know, as abuse. For sure, that was in many places, and you know, and people came from mostly large companies where this was tried, and it did not work out in favor of developers. So that was a hesitation for sure, Mario, to add a concrete answer to your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think Bogdan has a kind of follow up on this last question, if we can do that.
Yeah, I'll answer because it's just too darn good and too tempting. This is do you feel that Agile, be it LeSS or Nexus, can survive coach leaving and executive click change? So I would say that's always a challenge. That executive change, senior executive change, if you have someone who comes in who has a much different belief system, and if they indeed have the power to completely reshape the organizational structure, then what comes with that is the ability to continue to make things much better, or to continue to make things much worse. You cannot get around that. I think that if you wish to survive your external experts leaving, I don't know anything that does it better than LeSS. Again, the reason I like LeSS so much is because it goes after those elements that the others remain silent on. And everything that went well was because we actually addressed those structural elements that that were the root cause, to the extent that it probably didn't sustain itself after I left, in addition to the change in executive leadership and the massive layoffs, was to the extent that we did not address those things, that if you read, you know, the stack of LeSS books will say, hey, you really need to go after this. And certainly that resonates in my mentorship. And if you, when the full case study is available, you will see that the case study is an exercise in, it's a very instructive failure that blossomed in, let's say, medium depth soil, and, you know, started to really bear some great fruit, and then eventually hit rocky soil and didn't take hold in the way that it could have. So it did well enough to really do well. And then because it didn't have the nurturing of that new SVP, and because we didn't set up a parallel organization with, you know, completely revamp the HR policies like we should have, it didn't stick and flatten out the org. It didn't stick in the long term to the extent that I would hope that it would. And that's a lesson of, you know, partly what I like about LeSS is I can look back at everything I've done that has been very successful, and everything in LeSS resonates with that. And I can look back at things I've done in the aspects and the facets that have failed, and LeSS says, yeah, by the way, if you do this, it's going to fail. And I go, yeah, well, yeah, it did. And it did because I didn't do the very thing that Larman and Voss are talking about. Or in many cases, it's really not me, it's the client, because I'm just a consultant, right? Okay, so thank you so much, guys. I am trying to learn, and Mitri and I are trying to learn to run this thing in a much more compressed cycle. If you look on my website, you'll see a very long version of this that we did for LeSS Twin Cities, where we did the presentation part was about 50 minutes. So we went into far greater depth, and then the questions went on. Man, these guys just kept asking questions, and it went on for another like hour and a half of Q&A. Really great deep Q&A, fantastic. I think if you've liked the taste of this, you'd watch that thing and you'll learn even more. And I think you'll find that it's a much deeper presentation. But I don't know, and here's this, we're to get back to the retro here. I find myself struggling in how to achieve a similar depth while keeping the presentation down to say 20-ish minutes. I think we really took about 25 minutes. And yet I think the questions are the most interesting part of this, right? The Q&A dialogue and having Mitria here on the call. So it's not just me yakking, it's someone who was actually there in a management role that's able to talk to what actually happened without that filter. I think that's the meatiest part of this whole presentation. And so I'm gonna throw this to the facilitators here. What do you suggest for a retrospective on this? What technique you think will work best to kind of what went well, what didn't go well, how do I make this thing better?
Bogdan, will you?
Honestly, I would go simple. I would say something like, how did you feel here? Are you seeing yourself as a shopper, explorer, prisoner, or vacationer? And that could give us an insight. Like how
Let's do that and then follow that. Okay, so everybody, what are the options?
Explorer, meaning learning new stuff, you know, reaping through the jungles of knowledge. Shopper, you know, basically browsing by, maybe seeing something interesting. Prisoner, pretty much self-explanatory. Or vacationer, like, hey, you know, I've basically came here to autopilot for an hour or so.
And just have them chat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Boris put a link with explanations of this exercise if anyone needs.
Didn't set a mural for that, but you know, we can also, if people want, we can drop it in chat. We can see whatever works.
Yeah, just drop in chat, and I guess we'll see what we do, and then we'll go from there, right?
Yep. Okay. So let's do that for the next minute.
Sorry, I didn't think through the retro at all. Okay, how about a question? What one, just type in chat, what one or maybe two things would you do different to make this better?
That's also a good idea. So, okay, we have some ideas already. Great. Okay, as people are drawing their conclusions and maybe some insights and advice for next lectures, I'll take that time to display gratitude to our guests. I think that all participants here learned some valuable information, and it's always great to hear things from hands-on experience and from some case studies like this one. So I think that's really like something that differentiates this meetup from some of the others, and I really want to thank you, James and Mitya, for your time and energy and effort in this one. And also I'll take this opportunity to maybe say what we'll talk about next on our meetup, Scrum Sedom, and we will have our new guest, Martin Hinselwood, and he will talk about Taylorism, Ludities, and other oddities plaguing Agile. Like, he'll talk about how to fight bad Scrum implementations and how maybe to prevent it. We'll see where that goes. Okay, so Bogdan, do you have any maybe follow-up or additional information on that you want to share?
No, just would like to welcome you on team once more and thank all the crew for joining us on this Wednesday, and especially our guests, James and Mitya.
Thank you for everybody's interest. I appreciate the opportunity. I do. And your guinea pigness. So this is that's helpful too.
Yeah, thanks everybody in the meetup, and thanks for your time and for your attention, and thanks James for opportunity that he gave to me to explore this and participate in this and actually implement. Really amazing year and a half of my career doing this, truly. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so if that's all, yeah, I think we can close this Scrum Wednesday for today.
But is there anything we can do for you, like a return favor?
Oh yes, easy. I'm between clients. I almost have one closed, but not quite. And you know, I need work, and I'll go anywhere around the world for someone that wants real change. I would rather do real change any day than the illusion of change. As long as they can bear the freight, which is, you know, not cheap. It's not cheap to fly people around the world, but yeah, that's what I'm looking to. I really enjoy. This makes people's lives better when you do it right. Yeah. And life is short, and I don't want to spend my life doing fake change that gets rolled back, right? I want to do change that when we're done, people's lives are better. And I'll go where that needs. My wife and I will go, and the dog will go where opportunity presents itself to help me make people's lives better. So how do you help me? Refer people my way that have that hold on to the purse strings, that might be interested in real change. So, and thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Great. Those are some great thoughts for the end. Thank you, James. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Right.